Welcome everyone to our seventh session. I think we're on now. Our seventh drop-in session of the summer. Today we are going to be looking at another spiritual practice together. All of our drop-in sessions during the course of the summer of 2022 have been looking at how God teaches us in His Word to stay emotionally healthy and spiritually alive in the chaos of the modern world. And particularly in these last 4 sessions that we're having in August, we are looking specifically and clearly how we can practice this and live it out faithfully. Much of our content comes from John Mark Comer's study on simplicity from the ruthless elimination of hurry, but there is lots more to study on this topic. So if you want to be directed to other resources, one of which is another session that we've done on the practice of simplicity in the past in Bridges, please let me know and I'm happy to provide those for you. So as always, these sessions are a great invitation. It is an invitation to take a deep breath, to lay aside our phones and our lists, our work, our housework, our schedules, our obligations, all of our doing and producing. It is an invitation to let our hearts slow down, to let God take care of the world. It is an invitation to come away with Jesus to a quiet place and get some rest. An invitation to come to Jesus, all of us who are weary and burdened, knowing and trusting that He will give us rest. It is an invitation to take His yoke upon us and learn from Him, for He is gentle and humble in heart, and we will find rest for our souls. For His yoke is easy and His burden is light. Now, in previous sessions, we have covered some of the deeply harmful ways of life our culture promotes, and we've contrasted that with the way Jesus lived when He was on earth, when He demonstrated how to live well as a human being, how to live according to how God has created us. And we've also discussed how Jesus calls us to a way of doing life, an easy yoke that provides us with tools and practices that help us handle the burdens of life well. And this easy yoke includes the practices of Jesus, or as they are more traditionally known, spiritual disciplines or spiritual practices tends to be the term I go with most of the time. Habits of Jesus was another way of describing them. Now, so far, we've explored the spiritual practices of silence and solitude and Sabbath. And so if you want to look at any of those past sessions, they're all in the same playlist as this one. But if you do have any difficulty finding anything, get in touch, please. I want to connect you with resources. Now, our session today is on the next spiritual practice, which is simplicity. John Mark writes, "Let's start out with a few sayings of Jesus that, if we're honest, most of us disagree with or at least dislike." Wonderful foot to start on. Luke 12, verse 15 says, "Watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions." And then in Luke 12, verse 33, Jesus says, "Sell your possessions and give to the poor." In Matthew 6, verses 25 and verse 33, "Do not worry about your life, what you will eat or drink, or about your body, what you will wear. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothes? Seek first God's kingdom." Now I'm going to back up a slide actually. These can feel counterintuitive, irresponsible, and unrealistic, and even overly idealistic. Like Jesus is out of touch with the concerns and responsibilities of life. And particularly when we look at the next passage, we need to remember that Jesus very deliberately came to earth as a human being. He was incarnate. He took on flesh. And he did so because it was important that he lived not only a perfect human life, but a genuinely human life. And we studied this in our last main study in Bridges when we looked at Hebrews and about how being human and living life out as a human being was part of how Jesus became our perfect high priest. It was important that he suffered. It was important that he understood what it meant to live life as a human being through experience, which then makes him perfectly positioned, not only to tell us what to do, but to help us do what we need to do. And so while it may seem like Jesus is out of touch in some of these verses, that is exactly the opposite of what is going on here. God has never been more in touch than in the incarnation, literally in touch. Mark 4, verse 19, Jesus says, the worries of this life, the deceitfulness of wealth, and the desires for other things come in and choke the word, making it unfruitful. And John Mark comments, you're saying that wealth is by nature deceitful, a personified con artist, that it has a suffocating effect on the soil of my heart, choking out the life of the kingdom. Now, Jesus is not standing at a far off distance and saying this. He is right not only in the world, but in a particular community saying this to particular people. He is as in touch as he can possibly be when he says this. Then in Matthew 19, verse 24, he says, again, I tell you, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for someone who is rich to enter the kingdom of God. And John Mark says, you're saying wealth makes it harder to experience the life of God's reign, not easier? That does not compute. The more money I have, the better my life seems. Then he continues, confused? If these sayings of Jesus sound crazy to you, well, you're not alone. They do to most of us in the West. When I first started to take Jesus seriously as a teacher, not just as a savior, it was his vision of the role of wealth in the good life that was most jarring to me. And honestly, it took me years to even agree with him. If you're not on board with Jesus' view of money, it could be that you, like many Christians in the West, myself included until quite recently and with frequent relapses, don't actually believe in the gospel of the kingdom. The good news that the life you've always wanted is fully available to you right where you are through Jesus. And through him, you have access to the Father's loving presence. Nothing, not your income level or stage of life or health or relational status, nothing is standing between you and the life that is truly life. That's from 1 Timothy. It could be that you believe another gospel, another vision of what the good life is and how you obtain it. This is actually really wonderful timing because on Sunday, James Vandermeulen preached a sermon on this, on the different gospel, in particular, the prosperity gospel that he mentioned, as well as our human tendency to make blessings from God the ultimate thing in our lives rather than God himself. In his book, John Mark refers to this as the gospel of America. Bless him. And he says this gospel makes the exact opposite claim. In a nutshell, the more you have, the happier you will be. Now, when we're talking about the more you have, this can include possessions, of course, and income, but it can also include homes, promotions, bonuses at work, trips and travel, experiences, and so on. So don't just limit this to the stuff that fits inside your house. Vehicles could be on that list too. It is not only what you own, but what you are responsible for and what is connected to your career and your schedule. Now, There's a French sociologist named Jean Baudrillard. That's not super important, but he studied the role that materialism plays in Western culture. So this is not limited to France or the States. This is the entire West. What is important is what he observed in this study. He says that materialism has become the new dominant system of meaning. And he goes on to argue that atheism hasn't replaced cultural Christianity. Shopping has. John Mark writes that we now get our meaning in life from what we consume. We even get our identity from the things we buy or sell. And for a lot of people, things aren't just things, they are identities. There's a reason the only other God Jesus ever called out by name was Mammon, the god of money. That's from Matthew 6:24, and he notes there that the NIV correctly translates it as money, and in older translations, you'll see it listed as mammon. He says, because it's a bad god and a lousy religion. It is another gospel. It isn't true or life-giving. And it will, in fact, not just make following and believing the true gospel more difficult, it is going to actively choke out in our lives, actively choke out that gospel in our lives if we do not deal with it properly. This is a dangerous place for us to be in. And so we need to know, how do we deal with this danger, this threat to us, carefully and well? Before we get to how we deal with it, though, because I got ahead of myself and was paying attention to my notes, we first need to talk a little bit about how we got here. A little bit of history and cultural analysis helps us discern what's going on and then where and how to guard our hearts and minds. So John Mark writes, it hasn't always been this way, even in America. Yes, our nation is a social experiment built around the pursuit of happiness, but it wasn't until quite recently that we redefined happiness as making lots of money and owning lots of stuff. And he goes on to explain that a century ago, most people in North America were farmers. And over the decades, both Canada and the US have become increasingly urbanized and industrialized. We've moved to cities, and more jobs are related to the production of goods apart from farming. Now, a lot of John Mark's analysis here is going to be focused on the States because that's where he's from, that's where he ministers. But really, Canada is not that different, and the principles are going to hold pretty darn well here. So let's not think of ourselves as the exception to any rules. John Mark writes that the two world wars in turn created the military-industrial complex, and once the tumult of war calmed down, the power brokers of the day had to find a way to keep all those factories open and people employed. Tank factories were repurposed to make t-shirts. I'm not much of a conspiracy theorist, but it's an open secret that after the war, the tycoons of big business, the shadow politicians of DC, and the madmen of New York City conspired to remake the American economy. Their agenda? To create an entire economy, and with it, culture, out of consumerism. Paul Mazur of the Lehman Brothers, who was a Wall Street banker, he said, we must shift America from a needs to a desires culture. People must be trained to desire, to want new things, even before the old have been entirely consumed. We must shape a new mentality. Man's desires must overshadow his needs. This is a wonderful example of why I am so passionate about spiritual practices and our active pursuit of discipleship, because one way or another, we're going to be discipled by something or someone. I would much rather choose to be discipled by Jesus and lean into the sanctifying work of the Holy Spirit than have Mr. Mazur here be in charge of shaping my mind and my heart. One way or another, either we are going to be discipled by God, by Jesus, or we are going to be discipled by the culture. E.S. Cowdrick, who was the pioneer of industrial relations, he called it the new economic gospel of consumption. And their plan worked. It worked so well that consumerism is now often conflated with patriotism. Our duty to our countries is an economic one: to buy, to sell, to keep the economy going and growing. There is a kind of, I'm going to say, celebration of entrepreneurs. So that is such a noble calling. It's an interesting phenomenon. Another example that John Mark provides is a few weeks after 9/11, President Bush was making a speech encouraging the nation to get back on track. And at one point, he warned against terrorists frightening our nation to the point where people don't shop, which is an interesting comment for him to include. John Mark says, but the crazy thing is, that's exactly what we did. In fact, we bought so much stuff and borrowed so much money to do it that our entire economy crashed only a few years later. Yes, that's an oversimplification, but not by a lot. I say this not to dishonor a president for a slip of the tongue, but to situate it in a larger cultural trend. We need to recognize that our leaders, they're not responsible for the culture, they are a product of the culture. So, in no way, shape, or form are we going to villainize President George Bush here, because as we've seen already, this is an issue that goes all the way back to right after World War II. Now, the reason that we need to point all of this out and have discernment about what is going on is because when we are immersed in this our entire lives, I'm pretty sure everyone who could possibly be listening to this is going to have been born post-World War II, or at least been an adult post-World War II. We have grown up with this. We have lived with this for decades. This is what we know to the point where it is mundane familiarity. This is a push from World War II to the present. It is normal to us. It's just our way of life. It's our culture. And we often don't question what is so familiar that it feels normal, but we need to question it. We should question it and check it against the truth of the Word of God. John Mark writes, it's easy to forget that most advertising is a form of propaganda, one that plays not on our prefrontal cortex, where we are rational and logical, in charge of our decision making, but to a deeper and less logical part of us. This is reactivity that is being encouraged, not just on an individual basis, but in the culture overall, because reactive people, they tend to spend money. Before World War II, advertising was about quality, longevity, and necessity. So some examples that John Mark provided. The first one is simplicity, durability, speed, visible writing, Franklin typewriter. Short, sweet, so much to the point. And then the next one says, Dr. Warner's celebrated coralline corsets. They are boned with coralline, which is the only material used for corsets that can be guaranteed not to wrinkle or break. And tired? Then drink Coca-Cola. It relieves exhaustion, which is like the shortest Coca-Cola ad I think I have ever seen. Now, John Mark says you'll notice absolutely nothing in those examples about how a product will make you happy. You would be very hard-pressed to find an example of advertising today that doesn't attach something like happiness or rest or hope or joy or adventure or the better life in some regard to its messaging. Now, more history. During World War II, the Nazis took the ideas of the American psychotherapist Freud and used them to manipulate the people of Germany with propaganda. Their goal was to emotionally trick people into decisions that supported the Nazi agenda by appealing to their unconscious drives of desire and fear. It was deeply manipulative. I think we're probably all familiar with how incredibly damaging the outcome of this was. Now, after the war, Freud's nephew, Edward Bernays, who also lived in America, he needed a job. And John Mark explains that his theory was that if the Nazis could manipulate people in wartime, then surely business owners and politicians could manipulate people in peacetime. And he called his new idea public relations and became the so-called father of American advertising. So here's a nice little quote from the father of American advertising. The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. We are governed, our minds are molded, our tastes formed, our ideas suggested, largely by men we have never heard of in almost every act of our daily lives. We are dominated by the relatively small number of persons who pull the wires which control the public mind. You are going to be discipled one way or another. John Mark writes, advertising is propaganda. It might not be trying to get you to kill Jews, gypsies, and the LGBTQ people, but it is a multi-billion-dollar industry that is intentionally designed to lie to you, to get you to believe that if you will only buy this or that product, then you will be happy, or at least happier. So the goal of advertising, it is to stoke wants and desires in us and to convince us that our wants are actually needs. Now, there are actually a few other interesting phenomena that study after study keeps finding regarding our relationship to stuff, to wealth. First, that we tend to become so accustomed to modern conveniences so quickly that they become a new normal and we consider them needs to the point where we believe we are fully entitled to them and even cannot be happy without them. One of the best examples for me is actually when the power goes out and all of a sudden, like, I can't function for like a good half hour before I'm like, we can handle this. It throws me off. For example, modern conveniences such as having a car, a telephone, electricity, and running water, these are all fairly recent in the grand scheme of things. Really, the last couple of centuries, I guess, we've had electricity. My math is really bad today. But people have been around a lot longer than that, like literally thousands of years. And so we are not the rule. We are the exception to the rule historically. We're those strange ones. We're the ones in a very weird and unusual situation, having things like electricity. Now, how our society runs things, these are necessities. We do need them in order to interact well with our society more often than not. But we sometimes forget that people lived a really long time without these things and were happy. So our happiness then cannot be logically located in modern conveniences. And it is important that we start recognizing this, because when the culture tries to tie our happiness to other things, we're going to be much more sensitive and discerning. We can be grateful for all of these things. I am super grateful for things like running water and electricity. The electricity in particular is enabling me to record this for you right now. But we should not attach our happiness to them. And Jesus actually put the number of our material needs at a whopping 2 things: food and clothing. In 1 Timothy 6, verse 8, Paul writes, if we have food and clothing, we will be content with that. John Mark adds shelter to the list because where we live, weather happens. It's not as warm and temperate and gentle and dry as the Mediterranean Sea area was where Jesus lived, but that's still a very short list of physical needs, material needs. John Mark writes, what if the only material things we need to live rich and satisfying lives are food to eat, clothing on our backs, and a place to live? Now, if you doubt your ability to live that simply and thrive, you're not alone. The propaganda machine is working like a charm. Most of us believe the lie. More money and more stuff equal more happiness. And like all the most dangerous lies, it's a half-truth. More money does make you happier if you're poor. I hate the way some idealistic Christians who aren't poor glamorize poverty. It's horrible. Lifting people out of poverty will make them happier, but only up to a point. And this brings us to the other phenomenon, which is the income cap. We reach this level of income that meets our needs in our context, where we live, the responsibilities we have, and after that, we actually don't get happier. The opposite happens. Now, this number shifts somewhat depending on where you live, if you have a spouse, kids, etc., but it is a genuine recorded phenomenon. When you get beyond that kind of ideal income level, and not like what we think would be the ideal income level, but literally it's very much needs based. Money and possessions and work and leisure and desire start taking hold of the heart in unhealthy ways. And there are long-term effects of that that diminish our happiness, our quality of life. Even though on paper, the math looks good, there is a genuine effect on us psychologically, emotionally, spiritually, that is not good at all. This is one of the reasons we are encouraged in the Bible to be generous and give wealth away. It keeps it from having a hold on us. It keeps us free from its rule. It keeps us and our wealth that God has entrusted to us soundly under the lordship of Jesus. So I mentioned in our session on the Sabbath that one of the ways that we can deal with the influence of capitalism is having good limits for ourselves, limits on how we engage with the economy and how we spend money, what and how much we buy, and so on. John Mark points out that one factor we often forget to consider when adding to our possessions is time. We don't listen to this limit. Not only the time to care for that thing, the maintenance, upkeep, but also the time spent in earning the money to purchase that thing and the time we will spend using it. So he gives an example in the book of getting a motorcycle. Not only does it have the repeated cost of money and time to maintain it, but it costs time to use it. And it costs time to earn the money to purchase the bike and earn money to keep it maintained. So this is a much more serious consideration than just impulsively buying a motorcycle. There's going to be kind of a ripple effect on the time investment that is not only required up front, but over and over and over. Doesn't mean that it's bad to buy a motorcycle, but you need to think it through. When I was needing to downsize and move, it was extremely good for me because all of a sudden I started thinking, I have limited space. It's costing me so much to pay for that space. Is this item actually worth it to me? Is it actually worth, first of all, the time and effort and mental energy to pack it, move it, house it, care for it, and then to the exclusion of something else? Because I do have limited space. And so if it's the choice between keeping that thing and this other thing, suddenly those decisions became way easier. And I realized that my abundance of space, as much as I enjoyed it, was probably not good for me because it was letting me keep things that I did not need to keep, which made the whole process very overwhelming. This is why it was good for me to clear things out. Now, one thing that John Mark does not cover in the book that I'm sure women in particular are going to be familiar with is the mental load of dealing with possessions and maintaining the home. The more stuff you have, the more there is to organize and clean and keep in usable condition. And there's clutter sometimes to deal with, which absolutely has an effect on our minds, some of us more than others. And then it's a matter of managing it all, remembering where things are, ensuring things are stored properly, the regular maintenance of those things, making sure those things are taken out and used when appropriate and put back well. Now, there are many things, I am sure, that are worth this, and I am not arguing that. But the more we have, the more that mental load increases. And at some point, it's going to tip over the edge, and that mental load ceases to be worthwhile. It becomes overwhelming, and we have to cut things back until that load is manageable, or it's going to continue to damage us. It is so freeing then when we reduce what we have, not simply because we have more physical space in our lives, and that is wonderful, but we have more mental and emotional space. We can devote more of ourselves, to what genuinely matters to us because we aren't spread so thin between so many things. Things do genuinely take time, attention, energy. They might only take little tiny bits, but those little tiny bits, they add up. I now only decorate for Christmas. I used to have seasonal decorations for everything. And you know what? I got tired. There was a time when it gave me a bit of joy, but it wasn't a lasting joy by any means. It was a lot of work. And when you store this stuff, like 95% of the year, there's time to set up, it's time to clean it, it's time to take it down, it's time and energy to figure out how to decorate things, and then the same to undo all that, how to pack it away, and then it's just taking up space. Most of the time, it is away, not being enjoyed, and just taking up space. Now, for some people, that's very much worthwhile. And again, no judgment. If that brings you a level of joy, it didn't bring me, grand. I have this one family that I teach piano lessons to. I love going to their house because I think it's about every 2 months, they change seasonal decorations. And I love it. But it is this wonderful family activity for them. And you can tell that things are chosen with care, and there's a sentimentality and a joy there. And I love it. But for me, it very quickly becomes burdensome. This is not something that belongs in my life. It's great in theirs. I found far more joy and freedom getting rid of most of my decorations. I still kept some, but I even got rid of like half of my Christmas stuff, which for those close to me know that is a very big deal. But it was well worth it to me because that mental load was so much less. And I didn't have to feel guilty about not using things or forgetting that I had things. It got out of control for what worked in my life. And so when I started honoring those limits, paying attention to them, I just let those things go, life was so much better. Now, as interesting as ideas from my life happen to be, when we are figuring out good and healthy limits for us in our relationship with wealth, the best source is, of course, Jesus. Now, this is something I didn't get to include in the main session in person because I hadn't listened to his sermon yet. But Tim Keller did this wonderful sermon several years ago where he talks about how the Bible does not give us straight answers a lot of the time about how we are to live our faith out. It tells us that we do need to live our faith out, and it will give us lots of examples. But it does not tell you this is the job you should choose, or this is the way that you should handle this exact situation and relationship. Instead, it tells you all the time about what type of people would do the right thing. And then it's up to us to kind of figure out what the right thing is in our context. It makes us wrestle with it. And we're going to see the same thing when we are looking at Jesus' life. We are going to see lots of examples of how he walks this out. We're going to see the principles that he brings up, the truths that he shares, and that truth is important. But then we have to figure out how this translates into our context. God will absolutely help us with that. But we can let it look different. At no point are we going to be silly about this. We're going to be adults. We're not going to be silly and assume that we are supposed to live a nomadic life and wear the exact same clothing that Jesus did and travel around with 12 friends. And like that's not how it translates into our context. So we need to instead look at what the truth is. And then with God, start wrestling with our own circumstances. How can we live this out well? What boundaries are going to work for me to enable me to be obedient and follow the truth? So John Mark writes that Jesus was the most intelligent teacher to ever live. His teachings aren't just right in some arbitrary moral sense. They are good. And that's what morality is, the good and true way to live. Now, in reality, Jesus' moral teachings aren't arbitrary at all. They are statements about how the world actually works. And if you ignore them, not only do you wreck your relationship with God, but you also go against the grain of the universe he created. So many of Jesus' teachings, especially on money and stuff, were just telling stories about the world, the way the world actually is. I love this observation. So in Acts 20, verse 35, it is more blessed to give than to receive. That's not a command. That's just an observation. In Matthew 6, verse 24, you cannot serve both God and money. Again, an observation. It is a statement of fact. Luke 12, verse 15, life does not consist in an abundance of possessions. This is a fact. This is the reality we actually deal with. So John Mark writes, he was teaching what's true. Whether we believe him or not is another matter. Either way, his ideas about money and stuff correspond to reality. And that means then that what Jesus says about wealth, money, and stuff helps us navigate our relationship with wealth well, because it's not propaganda. It's not just words trying to make us emotional and impulsive and manipulate us into doing what he wants us to do because it serves his purposes. Jesus doesn't manipulate people. He teaches them the truth, and then he invites them to follow him. And when we do follow him, he faithfully leads us to the abundant life. That's his agenda. And he never does it through manipulation, but through invitation. So let's look at some of Jesus' teachings. In particular, we are going to focus on Matthew 6 in the Sermon on the Mount. I like this because it's a really good preview of what we get to study in depth in the fall. The Sermon on the Mount includes some of Jesus' most in-depth teaching about this topic, and it actually takes up about 25% of the sermon. So it starts, "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moths and vermin destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moths and vermin do not destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." So basically, don't invest all your time and energy and money in things that get old and rust and go out of style and can be snatched from the back of your car if you park too far from the street lamp. Instead, put your life into things that matter, like your relationship with God and life in His kingdom. Because where you put your resources is where you put your heart. It's the steering wheel to your engine of desire. Then the passage continues. Jesus continues. "The eye is the lamp of the body. If your eyes are healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eyes are unhealthy, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light within you is darkness, how great is that darkness?" Now, this bit about eyes is a first century idiom. This is a beautiful example of why we need to study historical and cultural context. John Mark explains that in Jesus' day, if people said you had a healthy eye, it had a double meaning. It meant that one, you were focused and living with a high degree of intentionality in life, and two, you were generous to the poor. When you looked at the world, you saw those in need and did your best to help out. An unhealthy eye, or as the King James Version has it, an evil eye, was the exact opposite. When you looked out on the world, you were distracted by all that glitters and lost your focus on what really matters. In turn, you closed your fist to the poor. Now the passage continues, "No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money." Now we are very used to reading these passages kind of in isolation, as though like Jesus was just like popping through different topics and he didn't intend for them to be read together. This is all one sermon though. And we don't like have like little soundbite sermons where you get like 8 sermons in one service. You get one. This is meant to be one cohesive whole. So Jesus is continuing the same topic here. John Mark writes, "For Jesus, it's a non-option. You cannot serve God and the system. You simply can't live the freedom way of Jesus and get sucked into the overconsumption that is normal in our society. The two are mutually exclusive. You have to pick. You can't have a good eye and an evil eye at the same time." I'm scrolling back at my notes here. "You can't store up treasures for yourself on earth and treasures in heaven." It's going to be one or the other. Now, I'm not saying like sometimes we get it right and sometimes we get it wrong. And when we get it wrong, it eliminates the times we got it right. That's not how it works. This is going to be messy for us to work out because it takes time to learn it. But you cannot do both at the same time. You have to pick. Jesus continues, "Therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life." John Mark writes, notice how Jesus connected money to stuff and worry. The word therefore is the key. It ties together 3 short teachings on money and stuff to one long teaching on worry, which was the point. And so if we read that in Matthew 6, you'll see the full version. Ignore the different headings and paragraph breaks. Just read it straight through. It's about worry. And the basic point is we worry about what we worship. If you worship money, it will eat you alive. This is why Jesus makes such a big deal about it. This is why he gives so much time and attention to dealing with our relationship with wealth, not just money, but stuff. So now we come to the spiritual practice to help us apply these teachings to our lives. Use the easy yoke to deal with the burden of wealth and have rest and freedom and joy and peace in our lives as a result. This is what we are after. This is the practice of simplicity. It's also called simple living. It used to be called frugality, but there's some negative connotations with that now, so we kind of steer clear from that word. Minimalism is kind of a more secular version, but it's increasingly being talked about as minimalism in Christian circles as well. And looking at minimalism can be very helpful for learning how to live this out, or just to get ideas for how to live this out in our Western context. Now, a few things we need to clarify before we go forward. First of all, simplicity is not poverty. John Mark writes, it isn't a bare home, an empty closet, a joyless life with no freedom to enjoy material things. The whole goal is exactly the opposite, more freedom. Minimalism isn't about living with nothing, it's about living with less. Joshua Becker, who writes quite a bit on simplicity, he studies it just about full time at this stage. He wrote that that simplicity is the intentional promotion of the things we most value and the removal of everything that distracts us from them. That's where the freedom comes in. Richard Foster and Mark Scandrette define it, simplicity is an inward reality that can be seen in an outward lifestyle of choosing to leverage time, money, talents, and possessions toward what matters most. John Mark writes that notice that minimalism isn't just about your money and stuff. It's about your whole life. The goal isn't just to declutter your closet or garage, but to declutter your life. Now, clutter is anything that does not add value to your life, which sometimes might be a case of, okay, well, this thing adds a little value, or this activity adds a little value, but it actually costs way more in terms of my time, my energy, my attention than it gives back to me. And it's okay to realize that through trial and error. And just when you figure that out, make a change. Clutter is also anything that does not spark joy. If anyone here is familiar with Marie Kondo, I love that John Mark included that reference. It's also too much stuff in too small a space. Anything that we no longer used or loved, and anything that led to a feeling of disorganization. John Mark writes that the goal here is to live with a high degree of intentionality around what matters most, which, for those of us who apprentice under Jesus, is Jesus himself and his kingdom. If you're a bit cynical and you're currently thinking, isn't this just for rich people? Well, yes. Poor people don't call it simple living, they just call it living. They don't read books on minimalism, they pray for justice. In 1 Timothy 6, verses 17 to 19, it says, command those who are rich in this present world, which, darlings, is all of us because of where we live. So all of us, to some degree, need to give this attention. Command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant, nor to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain. Command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds, and to be generous and willing to share. In this way, they will lay up treasure for themselves as a firm foundation for the coming age, so that they may take hold of the life that is truly life. So what Paul is saying here is that living this way is a way that we reach out and grasp the life that is truly life. If there's anything that we own, any of our wealth, that is preventing us from doing good, being rich in good deeds, preventing us from being generous, that we're not willing to share. Anything that we are investing parts of ourselves in or making a priority in our life in ways that are not healthy, it needs to go. It will make us arrogant. It will make us put our hope in wealth. This is a dangerous place for us. This is less for the sake of everyone else and more for the sake of us. I can pause. Sorry for the interruption. I need to pick the times that I record a little better. That's twice now. Okay. John Mark says, think about Jesus. Simplicity is a practice that's entirely based on his life. Myth busting time. Jesus wasn't nearly as poor as many people claim. Before he became a rabbi, he was a tradesman, likely making a living wage. Once he started teaching full time, he was supported by a group of wealthy donors, mostly upper class women, who paid for his food and travel expenses. He even needed one of his disciples to manage the budget. He was friends with both the rich and the poor, but there are lots of stories about him eating and drinking at the home of one of his rich friends. So much so that the gospel writers admit he was accused, wrongly, but accused of being a glutton and a drunkard. Even at the cross, the Roman soldiers cast lots for his garments, meaning they were worth something and worth enough that they were fighting over them. In Jesus' life and teaching, we see the very same tension that runs all the way through the library of Scripture. On the one hand, the world and everything in it are very good and meant to be enjoyed and shared with those in need. This balance is so important for us to get. On the other hand, too much wealth is dangerous. That income cap we talked about is real. It is biblical. It has the potential to turn our hearts away from God. When that happens, our greedy, off-kilter hearts wreak havoc, not only on our own lives, sabotaging our happiness, but more importantly, on others, widening the gap between rich and poor and doing damage to the earth itself. There's a huge component here where, yes, it's going to affect us deeply. And first, it is kind of for our safety. But if we do not look after that, if we persist, it spreads. Sin does this, where it spreads to everything around us. It is corruptive, corrosive. However, we're talking about the balance between creation is good and meant to be enjoyed and shared with those in need, and on the other hand, too much wealth is dangerous. And so we see Jesus happily living in that tension, enjoying a good meal in a friend's home one minute and warning about what money can do to your heart the next. It is not contradictory. It's understanding the place that wealth should play in our lives and not allowing it to get out of those limits, to cross those good and God-given boundaries. We talked in the session on Sabbath about how enjoying what God has blessed us with is a grateful act of worship. We shouldn't lose that. I am not at all advocating that we need to get rid of our china, but rather use the china on Sabbath, right? Enjoy those things. And if it has such a hold on your heart, no judgment, but if it has a hold on your heart that it shouldn't, get rid of it because it's not going to be worth it. So listen, this is not saying you cannot enjoy the wealth that God has blessed you with, that you cannot enjoy good things or good food or trips and so on. But when these things have a hold on our hearts, they shouldn't. And God is the one who's going to know that best because he knows our hearts. When that happens, we actually can't enjoy them. We worry. They end up ruling us, and they're really mean about it. They end up exhausting us, taking life from us rather than being a blessing from God that is life-giving and brings us joy and peace and goodness. They cease to be good. They cease to be enjoyable. And we cannot hold on to those things and make it work. You have to let them go. When that happens, when God makes us aware of this, we need to deal with it. And sometimes that means giving things away or selling them. Sometimes it means giving away some of our income. Sometimes it means reconsidering that purchase. Sometimes it means a more modest vacation than indulging in extreme opulence. I'm not saying you never can. I'm just saying if it has a hold on your heart, if God is throwing up the red flag there, please listen. Sometimes it means laying aside something in our calendars and simplifying our commitments and hobbies. We reorder our lives so we can worship God well and enjoy and use what he's given us well. This is what leads to the abundant life. There's more that I want to say on this, but first, we need to hear directly from Mr. John Mark Comer. I am going to switch to the other screen. There it is.
Hey everybody, welcome to number 3 of 4 video tutorials for how to unhurry, the companion to my book, The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry. We're just working through some very practical exercises and practices to slow our mind and our body down to the pace of Jesus and to tap into this deep reservoir of his love and his joy and his peace where we just live present to the moment. You know, if you pay attention to the life of Jesus, you notice that his teachings on money and on things are some of his most radical teachings on record. I think of Jesus' line, "A person's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions." That is literally the exact opposite message of what we hear in ad after ad, story after story, as it comes to us through the gurus of marketing and advertising. Nothing wrong with that at all. I'm not down on things or stuff or even wealth. There's a place for all of that in gratitude. But when you watch the life of Jesus and you pay close attention, you realize his life was very simple, not just with things, with time, with relationships, with attention. He lived with a high degree of intentionality, focus, and as a result, I think of Eugene Peterson's translation of Matthew 11, freely and lightly. There's just a joy, a sense of humor, ease, a presence about Jesus. And I don't think it's a coincidence that his life was marked by the practice of simplicity. Now, there are all sorts of names for this practice or spiritual discipline: simplicity, simple living. The monks used to call it frugality. That has all sorts of negative connotations. Most secular people just call it minimalism. Now, minimalism is a great language for it, but often we hear that and we just think of a modern design house with no children and no mess or whatever it is. And simplicity is less about a design aesthetic or even how many things you have, though that's a key factor of it. It's just about how do we live where the main thing is the main thing, where our life is literally built around Jesus and our abiding prayer life with him, about the relationships that matter most to us, and about whatever the work or assignment that God has given us to do in the world is. Now, for this practice, we have some very simple exercises, most of which have to do with your stuff. How do you minimize? How do you cut your life, your stuff, your closet, your home, your apartment, your schedule, your budget down to the really good stuff where everything, every possession in your care, every moment of your day is just spent well. You feel really good about it. A few things to begin. You are going to need to start 4 piles. Use bags, use boxes, use containers, whatever works for you. The first pile is a giveaway pile. Here's something that I have that's in a closet, in a room, in my life, in my wardrobe, and I don't need it anymore. Let me give it away to somebody in need or a family member or a friend. Second pile is sell. This is something that I want to make some money on, and I can do whatever I want with that money in Jesus and his kingdom. And the third pile is to throw away or to recycle. This is just garbage, or this is just time to go into the recycling bin. And the final pile is the most important, and it's the weight pile. So one of the first things you discover as you begin to minimize your stuff and pare down your life is that most of us have a very emotional connection, more than we realize, with our stuff. We spent money on stuff. Money is a representation of time from our job or our work or whatever. And so often we get not only sentimental, but emotional about the stuff in our closet or in our home. And so if your experience is anything like mine, as you're doing this the first time or a couple of times, you'll have a lot of items, that shirt, a pair of shoes you don't really wear, and you don't really want them, but you spend a lot of money on them and you feel weird, or it was a gift from your grandma or whatever it is. Anything that's in question, just put it in the weight pile or in a bag or in a box. And then you just put that box away for whatever time period you set. I'd recommend, say, 6 months. And what you find is if at any moment something comes to mind, you're like, oh, I really want that jacket, or I really want that pot from grandma 3 Christmases ago, or whatever. I really want that bicycle I thought I would never use again. Whatever it is, just take it out of the box or the bag or the garage, and great, enjoy it, and consider it again another time. But more than likely, once stuff goes in that pile, box, bag, you won't even give it a second thought. And then when you reopen it 6 months later, a year later, whatever, it will be much easier to just let go of it, sell it, give it away, throw it away, recycle, whatever the need is. Now, 4 very simple exercises. Each one will take you a little bit of time, should be a lot of fun. Put on some good music or a movie in the background and just have fun with this. Exercise 1 is your closet. I really think the best place to start is your closet. You just go into your room, your bedroom, get your 4 piles ready to go, and then one idea is just to take every single thing out of your closet. Throw it on your bed or on the floor, just take everything out. It's literally empty, vacuum, clean your closet, whatever, and then begin to sort things into giveaway pile, sell pile, throw away, recycle pile, and weight pile, which more likely will be your biggest pile. And then as you're ready, just begin to add things back in. Now again, no legalism, no right, no wrong. You want to have a lot of things, you want to have a little things. There's all sorts of ways to do this. And I have some very specific examples in How to Unhurry that I've written up line by line. Exercise 2 is basically to do the same thing, but with your stuff. I recommend that you start somewhere easy and non-sentimental, like the bathroom or the linen closet, and then maybe move on to somewhere like the living room where there's no closet to mess around with, and then maybe end in the kitchen, which is a little bit overwhelming if you have a kitchen and it's full of stuff. And again, same thing, 4 piles. Take everything out if you want, or that's a little bit tricky in the kitchen, so whatever works for you. And again, same thing, 1 pile, give away, another sell, another throw away, recycle, and another keep or just wait on until next time. Put things back. And you'll begin to feel that as you do this, room by room, moment by moment, thing by thing, possession by possession, you will begin to just feel this freedom creep up in your heart and this weight that you didn't even know you were carrying of too much stuff, clutter, distraction, just fall off of your shoulders. Some of you will feel this more than others based on your personality, but I really think no matter what your personality is, you'll feel this, and you'll begin to feel, again in Matthew 11, freer and lighter. If your experience is anything like mine, you will have to do this more than once. We literally, my wife and I, started in our closets, went through every room in the house, and got more and more ruthless as we went on, and then had to do the whole thing again. And then 6 months later, we did it again, and then a year later, we did it again. And now we're down to the basis where we do this kind of once a year. We'll just go through each room, in particular with kids, which are just magnets for stuff, and just kind of do a declutter, a cleanse, an annual minimize day. Exercise 3 is to draw your attention to basically papers. If your life is anything like mine, you have drawers and closets and boxes just full of random photographs and papers and bills and records. And this stuff just begins to take up space and time and mess and noise and distraction. And this is the digital age. It's worth your money, I think, to go to Amazon.com or whatever, buy some kind of a scanner to just scan stuff in, make a digital copy. Almost anything that we have in paper, we can put into a digital copy, get rid of what we need to get rid of, put the rest on a laptop or a hard drive somewhere, and again, just begin to open up space in our life. Now, this one is a bit of a pain. It's not that fun. It will take you a little while. That's why I put it as week 3, not week 1. But just go through kind of your paper life, your photo life, and begin to just scan everything in, digitize everything, clean up the clutter in your life, and again, simplify your life to where you begin to live where the main thing is life with Jesus, relationships, and the work that God's put before you. Finally is just a week for budget and schedule, where you basically apply this logic of less is more, and life isn't about like more stuff often just equals more anxiety and more hurry rather than peace and joy and love. But you apply it not just to stuff and not just to papers, but to your budget and to your schedule. 2 of the main resources that we have to offer Jesus and the world, our time and our money. So a budget is pretty simple. There are all sorts of ways to do it. I have some ideas in the workbook that are written up for you, but come up with some kind of a budget, and then a schedule where you basically just get out a piece of paper or do it on your computer if you want and come up with your ideal schedule, your ideal week at a glance. Man, put in the spiritual disciplines that are dear to your heart right now. Put in the relationships that matter most. Put in dinner times with the family or a connect point with your best friend. Put in church in there. Put in work habits. Put in exercise, your 8 hours of sleep a night or whatever it is. Just come up with, man, this feels like what would be a really ideal week with Jesus, to just live with the easy yoke of Jesus with a lot of joy. Write both of those things up, a plan for your money, a plan for your time. Ideally share it with somebody to hold you accountable, and then pick a period of time to live into it, whether that's a month or a year or anything in between, and have somebody hold you accountable and tweak your practice as you go on. You want to add some time here, add some money there, change, detract, whatever it is. Massage it as you go along, but begin to work on living with a higher degree of intentionality, purpose, focus, and as a result, less and less anxiety, stress, distraction, busyness, and hurry, and more of the life that Jesus has for you. For more information, download How to Unhurry off of my website to begin your practice of simplicity.